Video game emulation is a touchy subject, but if you were a fan of Japanese RPGs or anime in the mid-90s to late 2000s, you more than likely know exactly how to run a Super Nintendo emulator. I ain't telling you, but at this time it was almost a necessity. Certain games would only get a single print, immediately becoming collector's items. There was of course no way to digitally purchase any of these, and if you were something like Chrono Trigger or Harvest Moon, you became rare pretty much right out of the gate. I've never even seen a copy of Dracula X before, and at this price loose, I probably never will. A lot of these games would get digitally re-released, ported, or remade over the years, but there remains a huge amount of games from the 4th, 5th, and 6th generation of video games that are stuck. And not just stuck on the console, but maybe stuck in a different format or in another language in a faraway land. I probably wasn't the only person who saw Final Fantasy VII and thought, wait, what? What about these? Then you log on to AOL, deep dive into weird forums like Game Winners or Eyes on Final Fantasy, and find all of these games that we were robbed of. Well, not robbed, just selectively not localized. Companies like Squaresoft, Konami, or even Nintendo were held in high regard at this time, but the Western audience would only get a fraction of some of their games. And a lot of them were actually pretty good. JRPGs were a dime a dozen back in these days, and presumably all of these companies decided against localizing all of them for that exact reason. Western kids were all about sports, punching, and weird platformers, and hyperviolence. Gotta rip the spine out. Unfortunately, this meant that we'd miss out on a lot of excellent games. Like a lot. Dragon Quest 5 and 6, Final Fantasy 2, 3, 5, every romancing saga, almost the entire Shin Megami Tensei franchise, Tales of Fantasia. Hell, until Super Smash Bros. Melee came out, I had no idea what a Fire Emblem was, and I used to think that it was just ripping off a Shining Force. It's not, but it is better. Sega for life. Weirdly enough though, every single one of the games I just mentioned would become playable for the Western market, just not in the most legal way. Thanks to the persistence and hard work of some of the small gaming communities navigating all of the red tape and gray legal areas, the mid-90s brought up a whole new scene exclusive to the internet, the fan-translated video game. So yo, it's Austin, #1 Balan champion. Former champion, and today we're going to be diving into the world of video game fan translations. But first, I want to talk to you guys about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community where millions of people just like you and me have come together to teach and learn. It's a great place to learn some new skills, dive further into your passions, and get lost in creativity. I shoot every single one of my videos on a DSLR camera, and I can recommend Justin Bridges' Fundamentals of DSLR Photography as a good starting point for learning how one of these things works. And there's a lot to learn. Or hey, maybe you're interested in learning another language. Skillshare has a bunch of different courses where you can learn the basics of, say, Japanese or German. There's even lettering lessons. Skillshare is curated for learning, meaning that with a premium membership, you'll have access to the entire catalog of classes, which means you can learn from them at your pace. And for less than $10 a month for an annual subscription, there's always something new for you to learn today that you couldn't do yesterday. So, just for you guys, the first 1,000 subscribers to click the link down in the description will get a free trial of Skillshare's premium membership so you can go off and explore your creativity. Thanks once again to Skillshare for sponsoring the channel. Now on with the show. Video game fan translations are a form of ROM hack that has been around for a long time. ROM hacking, despite the name, isn't technically hacking, but instead modifying a video game that's been exported as read-only memory, aka a ROM. This entails opening up the internal workings of a video game, going line by line and changing a bunch of number and hexadecimal values in order to get the desired result. Exciting, I know. The world of ROM hacking, though, is incredibly diverse. If a game's too easy, you can make it more difficult with a couple of number changes. Boom, Kaiser Mario.
I can't believe you've done this.
It's a truly fascinating, community-driven method of expanding the lifespan of a video game seen by countless projects like Zelda, Parallel Worlds, Final Fantasy VI, Brave New World, or the countless takes on Pokemon. What better way to play Pokemon than by amping up the difficulty with Radical Red, or by making everyone Moe with Moemon, you degenerates? Any not safe for work ROM hacks? Boy, you nasty. It's the same basis that all of the Mimi bootleg games are founded on as well. Everyone remembers Sonic the Hedgehog 4? No, not that one. The one for Super Nintendo. Also known as a bootleg of Speedy Gonzales' Los Gatos Bandidos.
Sonic!
This one dates all the way back to 1996. People have been making these things forever. But by far the most common, popular, and necessary form of ROM hacking was the translation hack. The one that required multilingual people to work countless hours to look through a game's code, translate and localize an entire script, menus, and come up with a typeface that fits the game's themes and space on the menus, or sometimes not. It's doing for free what entire studios and teams did for a living. Sometimes the accuracy of the translation can be a bit iffy, but you dealt with it. Even if they threw in random jokes because they were bored at 3 a.m. looking at you, Final Fantasy II. Some of the earliest fan translations date all the way back to 1993 when a Dutch group named Oasis decided that they were going to localize a bunch of Japanese MSX games. This included the original Legend of Heroes, Ys 1 and 2, and SD Snatcher, which I had no idea existed until right now. This is awesome and cursed. After this, throughout the mid-90s, a bunch of games would begin to get the fan translation effort, especially when it became evident that certain companies weren't gonna release a plethora of JRPGs in the West. The Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, and PlayStation 1 were blasting on most cylinders at this point, and certain key video games just weren't coming. There's a handful of smaller titles getting English ROM hacks here and there, a lot of unfinished projects as well, but the first major ROM hack, and probably one of the most important, was RPGE's Final Fantasy V, a huge game that was brought over and able to be played by anyone with an internet connection and a subpar PC. A game that could have potentially sold millions of copies for Square, that was localized and basically done for the English market, but was passed over for reasons? A good one, guys. But here I was, 1997 and 7 years old, able to play one of the coolest Super Nintendo JRPGs thanks to the work of 3 people who just wanted to play Final Fantasy V. The localization was up there with official quality, if not better. The game was awesome, of course, but this release and this group was just the beginning. From here, the gates were flung wide open. Websites popped up all over GeoCities with their translation groups, the projects they were claiming, and these massive RPGs they wanted to take on. And boy, were people gonna do some work. All for free, by the way. This was like an early sign of how restless and proactive a lot of these video game communities would become. And also, it was free video games, because it's not like you could pay for the official release, and I was 10, I didn't even know what the word import meant. So right now, we're gonna talk about a lot of games that Western publishers decided to pass up on, but really cool video games that volunteers put countless hours into making it happen. We'll get to the big ones like Mother 3, I'm sure that's the first thing that comes to mind, but first I wanna talk about some of the weird ones that I played growing up, some of which aren't even RPGs. There are a lot of really bad anime games that people translated for free, and you didn't have to do that, but you did. And I thank you. Thanks for me. Oh, anime. In the States, before Dragon Ball Z became popular, the licensed anime game had a close to zero chance of getting localized. Hell, even when the medium started to gain traction in the West, less than half of the anime games would make it over here. The absolute cowards over at Banpresto not localizing the Super Nintendo Slayers JRPG? Cowards. But the ones that did ended up being something special. Or Ranma 1/2 Hard Battle. But one day, Magic Ray Earth, I'll have you one day. The Super Nintendo had a ridiculous amount of licensed anime games for just about any series you could think of. So many, in fact, that a lot of them remain untranslated due to a lack of demand or interest. For now, if you want to play Ghost Sweeper Makami Joreishi wa Nice Body, you'll have to learn Japanese, or just mash through the cutscenes. But you know what did make it? JoJo's Bizarre Adventure for the Super Nintendo, the various awful Dragon Ball Z fighting games, the fantastic Sailor Moon Another Story, translated all the way back in 1999 by Bishojo Senshi Translations. The Shin-chan games, which are all so very weird. Heck, more recently, we've even seen translations of Nadia the Secret of Blue Waters JRPG and the Dr. Slump PlayStation 1 game, the latter of which just came out last week. But the one anime game that I played a ton of as a kid was Tenchi Muyo Game Hin for the Super Famicom. Tenchi Muyo was the first time I was introduced to the concept of harem anime, for better or worse. Probably worse. How this show, Tenchi Universe and Tenchi in Tokyo, made it onto primetime children's afternoon television on Cartoon Network is a complete mystery. Just paint fake swimsuits on them. Do it for Outlaw Star 2. Everything's fine. Booba. The game, though, was pretty alright. Originally ROM hacked by Lena Chan, Nuku Nuku, and Philia's translation domain, it's honestly a lot better than it has any right to be. It's like a strategy RPG starter pack with a Tenchi skin, decent music, and a good bit of fan service for those who like the series. I liked it, I'll tell you what. An RPG where I can play as Resident Best Girl Washu, I'll take it. I was 10. What do you want from me? There's no equipping items or stat management or anything complicated. It's just playing through the story, looking at all the girls fight over Tenchi, doing cool attacks, fighting his grandpa, transforming into funky space outfits, and like vibing with Tenchi mostly. But it was one of those games that had literally no chance of being localized. It's something that, thanks specifically to the internet at this time, that fans of the show or people aching for new RPGs could experience, even if it was riddled with weird translation errors, visual glitches, and a few bugs. But that's one of the fun things about the whole ROM hacking scene. LNF translation domain only worked on a handful of projects, stopping in 2000s. A few of the people helped with some other games like Trials of Mana, but Tenchi Muyo was left in this state until 9 years later when Borderline would step in and fix it up. There was no reason to do this, but it happened. Again, all for no charge. People are wild. Do I recommend Tenchi Muyo the game nowadays? Not really, but it was one of the important releases at the time. Same as a few years ago when a PlayStation 2 anime game that was highly sought after was finally translated. Around the same time that JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 5 Golden Wind was airing, a group of people with no other notable experience doing anything like this came out with an ISO hack, not just translating, but also adding a bit of voice acting into JoJo's Bizarre Adventure for the PlayStation 2. Now, ISO and ROM hacking are essentially the same thing, just one ends up being exponentially more work than the other due to the whole, well, game being bigger thing. But 16 years after its original release, this would become playable in the English language, and it's okay. Now, Capcom was pretty good in this era at localizing most of their releases in other countries, the most notable not making it probably being the Sengoku Basara games and Namco Cross Capcom. But JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was originally going to make it here. The last JoJo game, the excellent PlayStation 1 and Dreamcast fighter, made it to the States. But unfortunately, it seems like they dropped this one along the way, probably because the story would be very confusing. The game itself is a series of levels that are just boss fights, following the story of Golden Wind and all of its characters. The story's told through cutscenes and freeze-frame looking manga panels, and while it is an expedited version of a story that already exists, it's neat. It's hard to believe that Capcom thought that this was a no-go, but Under the Skin was a big yes. But what do I know? JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a neat little game with aura-auras and muda-mudas for days, and I think it's a fun thing for the Western-only anime fan of JoJo who's had to wait nearly 2 decades to play it. You know who you are. There's like 6 of you, right? There's countless licensed anime games that have been brought over into English from ROM hacking. Medarot R, Cardcaptor Sakura, Madoka Magica for the PSP, the absurd amount of Evangelion games, and more coming all the time. Maybe eventually someone will do the PlayStation 2 Ganbare Goemon game that I've been wanting forever, but for now, I'll wait. Or learn Japanese, that might be faster. All right, let's talk about Nintendo. Now, these days, Nintendo's very good about making sure that everything they release gets localized, but back in the day, not so much. I mean, hell, one of the oldest jokes in the book is the whole Super Mario Bros. 2 Doki Doki Panic thing. But that's just the beginning. There's the mysterious Murasame Castle, a Zelda-like on the Famicom disk system that was so close to Zelda, it's amazing it didn't originally make it. Let's not forget about the plethora of entire franchises that decided to just chill in Japan. Both Fire Emblem and the Famicom Wars games would be ignored by localization for multiple generations until they were deemed worthy on the Game Boy Advance. Nintendo must have thought that Americans weren't cool enough for their strategy RPGs, which is a shame because that means we didn't get Super Famicom Wars or Genealogy of the Holy War. It's their loss, I guess. There's a lot of glaring omissions throughout Nintendo's Western history. Custom Robo for the Nintendo 64, Excitebike, Mario Battle Stadium, Sin and Punishment, Giftopia, Doshin the Giant, and of course, Captain Rainbow. Yeah, this is totally normal. But there's 3 specific games they decided against localizing that to me were baffling decisions. The first being a super unique puzzle action game that was the directorial debut of Zelda series producer Eiji Aonuma, Marvelous Another Treasure Island. This game was like a spiritual successor to A Link to the Past fused together with The Lost Vikings of all games. And when I say successor, I mean Aonuma literally wanted this to be as close to Zelda as he could make it. You play as a trio of boys and the occasional floating cursor as you explore an island filled with mystery. It does a cool thing where it's constantly changing up how you play the game. You'll find little items for each of the 3 boys to play as, which allows them to interact with the environment in a different way. You can play as all 3 at the same time or switch between them and position them for certain actions like moving rocks, or you'll then go into the menu and start mashing away. There's a lot of unique ways to do things. It's a shame it's not co-op, because the nature of Marvelous would have been perfect for it. This game's pretty cool, but it didn't get a fan translation until Tashi's in 2012, and even then it wasn't fully finished until DAC R's final addendum to it in 2018, meaning that if even Nintendo's high-profile releases are still being tinkered with this far down the line, that there's always some free work to be done. Make sure to thank the ROM hackers. What about in the last year, or the last 2 months even? There's a lot of Nintendo Wii games that didn't make the jump overseas. Some of them I understand, some of them I don't, like what we're about to talk about, Blades of Regenleave. Also known as Zangeki no Regenleave, this game's the one time where Nintendo teamed up with the developers of Earth Defense Force to make Earth Defense Force, but set in Norse mythology. You play as Frey and Freya, no, not my cat. Yeah. And you play against the Jotun, who aren't as outright terrifying as a horde of giant ants, but still. I'm honestly surprised we didn't get this over here, but this is a decision made by a company who nearly slept on Xenoblade Chronicles for a Western release. Shout out to Operation Rainfall, a group who was very good at writing emails. Regenleave was an opportunity for Nintendo to have another game on their online services, as you could fight hordes, and I mean hordes of giant creatures with your buddies. The game itself played very uniquely, and thankfully supports classic controllers, so those of you who are completely inept at motion controls like myself can get in on the action. You use the Wii mode or the right stick to aim your weapons, or if it's a melee, you swipe across the screen to pull off attacks. The translator, who did French and English, Brand Newman, did a fantastic job localizing this. All of the menus, level description text, the various numbers going up, all make sense. Unfortunately, the cutscenes don't get a translation due to the way that they work in game, but everything else is totally playable. The game itself got mixed reviews, just like any old EDF game, but it was one of the highest selling Wii games of 2010 when it came out. You'd think they would have brought it over. The Wii U was still 2 years away, so I couldn't tell you why it didn't. But I can say that the soundtrack is pretty dope, which is to be expected by Danganronpa composer Masafumi Takada. Yep. That's the good stuff. But now for the game that's easily the most recognizable ROM hack of all time, Mother 3. The game whose decision to not localize remains a complete mystery and a really baffling decision by Nintendo, and one that probably comes straight to the front of the mind when you think of the words fan translation. They messed up. The Mother franchise is one of those strange game series that seems to be a product of its time. We didn't get the original until it was ported to the Wii U. The sequel was called Earthbound, came with this massive box filled with a strategy guide and scratch and sniffs. It also had an awful marketing campaign that said literally, "The book stinks too." Don't say that your game stinks, don't do it. Unfortunately, director and writer Shigesato Itoi's entire franchise seems to be destined to go down as a missed opportunity for English-speaking audiences. Despite now over 15 years of fans literally screaming for the thing and the ex-president of Nintendo of America turning them down endlessly, there's still no official Mother 3 localization in sight. Even now, after quitting his job, Reggie's joking about it on Twitter. Get him, Reg. Well, when you deny someone their meal, they're gonna do what they can to make it happen. 2 years after its original release in 2006, a group of translators in the Earthbound fan community pulled together a fan language hack that would go on to become one of the most popular in the entire scene. And well, Mother 3 is good. Like, really good. It's a tale about family and dealing with grief, being overcome with sadness and trying to move forward. Earthbound had its dark moments, but Mother 3 is like really dark with brief moments of happiness. It'll certainly pull at your heartstrings from the moment you turn it on. But none of this would be known to English-speaking audiences if it weren't for the hard work of the translation team led by a dude named Tomato. So props to y'all. They've also worked on putting it in other languages as well, and providing tools for people to do it. Mother 3 is one of Nintendo's finest JRPGs, and something I want to dive even further to one day. Unfortunately, it seems like after 15 years, Nintendo's not going to do anything about it. The only way I see this game getting a proper Western release is with a brand new remake or a collection, but we'll see what with Nintendo doing the Disney Vault thing. I can't believe Mario's dead. There's a ton of quality fan-translated Nintendo games out there, a lot of which you should give your time. But if I could make a quick request, please localize Buddy Mission Bond, an adventure visual novel with the art of Yusuke Murata, who did Ice Shield 21, my favorite manga. Please, for me? Okay, thanks, bye. I think it goes without saying that the most common type of fan translation from these days was the Japanese RPG, and there's no company that was more prolific about making those than Squaresoft. And they didn't just miss Final Fantasies over here, they missed a lot. Did you know that Squaresoft released 17 Super Famicom and Satellaview games in Japan that never came to the States? Yeah, 17. The States got 7 if you include Secret of Evermore. And sure, most of the ones we got were fantastic. Chrono Trigger's a 10 out of 10 classic, Final Fantasy VI might be even better. Mystic Quest is indeed a video game, my first RPG actually. But those 17 games we didn't get are nothing to scoff at. Just like with RPGE's Final Fantasy V, unlocalized Square games immediately became a priority target of ROM hackers, and they didn't disappoint. Two of the bigger groups doing JRPGs at this time were Aeon Genesis and DJAP Translations. The former are still working on ROM hacks to this day. Be it Super Robot Wars, Dragon Quest, Star Ocean, Tales of Fantasia, these two were nailing them out, which of course means we get some of those Japanese-only Squaresoft games. There's Treasure of Rudras, a JRPG leaning heavily into Hinduism, taking place right before the end of time as dictated by the god of destruction. There's Live Alive, one I played so much as a kid. In this game, you pick one of 8 main characters that all have completely different scenarios to play through. These all take place in different points in time with different characters and worlds to explore, all culminating in a final area and boss, kind of like Valkyrie Profile. Sure, it might have been a financial failure in Japan, but the game itself was pretty cool. It's also Yoko Shimomura's first big project at Square, and we all know how that goes. Pretty good, I'd say. Let's not forget games like the entire Romancing Saga franchise, which, while weird as heck, still deserved a chance. At least these got a modern remaster treatment, unlike the weird one-off titles like Treasure Hunter G, a rare case of Square publishing something. You know, when you look at how many games there are, it looks like it might have been hard for Square US to keep up with all of these huge text-heavy games, especially when you're trying to fit them in between Final Fantasies. But also, that means we lost stuff like Front Mission, which is one of the coolest little games on the Super Famicom. A customizable military mech strategy RPG with a heavy plot and the art of Amano? I'm sold. Except I wasn't, because we didn't get it. At least we got left alive, am I right? I think Seiken Densetsu 3 goes without saying. It's one of those big games that was a landmark release alongside Final Fantasy V and Mother 3, but I've talked about it in my Legend of Mana video. While those are all great losses, a game that I feel the West missed out on quite a bit was 1996's Bahamut Lagoon. What a cool game. So Bahamut Lagoon is a hybrid of strategy and traditional Japanese RPG. You play as, whatever you name yourself, normally Buu, the Dragon Commander of Kana. You put together little parties with all your units, each with their own equipable weapons, and engage in grid-based strategy combat. But for the hook, you get a dragon. Oh yeah. So each unit has their own dragon who acts in their own volition with AI that changes depending on how you raise them. Is the dragon being too smart and running away from combat? Just give them an erotic book. That'll work. So this makes this a JRPG, SRPG, monster raising video game. That's a lot of things, and it isn't the most complicated version of any of those, but it is a treat. It also looks great. The original ROM hack by DJAP Translations actually got superseded in 2021 with a new script and a bunch of bug fixes by Nier. But no matter which version you play, Bahamut Lagoon is a shining gem from Japanese Squaresoft that is awesome to play even today. Although this game somehow got a 29 out of 40 from Famitsu back in the day, yet Jojo All-Star Battle is perfect. Okay guys, the characters and script are a lot more humorous than you'd think from looking at the dramatic box art. The gameplay is very unique and the music bops quite a bit. When this game got its translation hack, needless to say, I spent a ton of time playing this thing over and over. I guess it came out a little late to be released in the States considering Final Fantasy VII was like 14 months away, but it's one of those gems that's worth your time. When the PlayStation 1 hit and JRPGs really took the center stage, Square got a lot better about making sure every big release was getting localized. Although it would take a couple more sacrifices to finally get Front Mission 3 in the States. With the exception of a few weird games like Racing Lagoon and a lot of the Chocobo games, we'd get just about everything. Though I guarantee there's someone still out there waiting for an ISO hack of All-Star Pro Wrestling on the PS2. You'll be able to play as Masahiro Chono one day, I promise you. These days, we tend to get most major releases localized, and if not, there's usually an Eastern Asian release like from the Philippines that has English support. It's becoming more and more uncommon to see a Japanese-only release, and that's a good thing. That means more people are working officially on translations, more people are buying things, and generally, everyone's happy. However, there are games that are still left behind every now and then, and there's still older projects that people are still working on, all for free. Now, obviously, with modern consoles being online only and harder to hack, the ROM hack isn't super common, but there are a lot of moddable PC games that are getting that support. People often tend to forget this, but prior to being published by Nicalis, Cave Story was originally a fan-translated version of a freely released game by Pixel. Aeon Genesis was responsible for localizing this bad boy years before it became a thing anyone tried to sell, and this is how I originally played it myself. If you haven't played Cave Story, by the way, you should. It's one of the earliest indie games I played, and the solo developer, Pixel, deserves the best. Another game that was finished by fans long before being brought over was the murder mystery visual novel Danganronpa, and for good reason. Before there was an official release of Danganronpa 1 and 2, they both had large followings in the internet fandoms due to a Something Awful Let's Play and the fan-translated patch by Project Zetsubo. I have a whole retrospective about how much I liked this series, but I don't think it would have gotten a proper Western release without loud support from fans and this version. Then you have cases where a team of people decided to fan-translate an entire massive multiplayer online RPG. Yeah, the official English release of Phantasy Star Online 2 went years without any updates. The old website said coming soon for over 6 years, which is bonkers. So fans who ran out of patience decided, screw it, let's do it ourselves. And you were able to log on to the Japanese PSO2 servers via fan translation English patch that made the entire game playable. To be updating this fan patch often enough to be keeping up with an active MMO all for free is some dedication. Obviously, as a lot of us know, the game would get an English release with the help of Microsoft in 2020, but for a majority of this game's lifespan, if you weren't bilingual and you wanted to play it, this was the way. Even if the sign-up process was a nightmare and you could get banned for having an American IP or buying in-game currency with a card that wasn't Japanese. Whoops. While the ROM translation scene has certainly slowed down from its late 90s, early 2000s heyday, the last few years have seen a ton of Nintendo Wii, PlayStation Portable, and DS games getting fan translations. The biggest in recent history having to be some of the Nihon Falcon games we missed. While Trails in the Sky FC went through its own localization hail, fans took it on themselves to translate Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure, two games that take place between the arcs that have been localized. Fan translation group The Geofront is currently in the process of finishing up Trails to Azure for this month, 10 years after its original release, and it's just a sign of the dedication a lot of fans will go for some of these games. I will probably play this one. Another one of the biggest projects in recent time, now that Sega Saturn emulation isn't awful, was 2019's release of the original Sakura Wars, the hybrid dating simulator strategy RPG with mecha robots that needed quite a sizable team just to put out. Never mind the release of Hideo Kojima's Police Knots, which I shouldn't talk about too much or Konami will destroy me, but it's there, just like Goemon. Gotta love Goemon. Previously mentioned Brand Newman is a prolific Wii translator who has released ISO hacks for 4 huge games that didn't make it over here. Beyond Regin Leave, we've got Tact of Magic, Night of the Sacrifice, and Earthseeker. 3 games I've never even heard of, but all of them looking like something I would have loved to play on the Wii when it was a bit dry on releases. Instead, we just got Arcrise Fantasia.
Watch where you're going, you idiot!
We're even on the verge of the 7th generation of consoles being accessible for hacking, which means that one day some brave soul is going to put in the time to localize the Yakuza spin-offs that take place in ancient Edo, Japan. Godspeed. The ROM hacking and translation scene is still really prolific in 2021, and that's something that's super cool to me. That means that kids these days are growing up with access to more and more games that they would have never had the chance to play back in the day. And it seems like it's going to continue on for the foreseeable future, as long as publishers don't send out cease and desist letters like Square Enix did for Final Fantasy Type O and the PSP. Thankfully, it seems more likely that publishers generally team up with these groups, which has led to official localizations of certain games like Ys Othenfelgana or various hentai games. Perhaps this is borderline fan labor, a debatably bad practice, but it seems like a decent amount of people who get into the localization industry start from fan translations. But there's even more people who've released a translation hack, just one, that has made the rounds for years and years. They go by an anonymous name, are impossible to contact, and have essentially just disappeared into the ether. Work from the 90s and 2000s that's still used today, done for no profit for maybe 10,000 people tops. These are the people of the early gaming community who are the real stars, and we should say thank you. It's because of people like you that people like me got to play all of these games that they would have never gotten a chance to otherwise, creating all of these memories. It's also why I played Takeshi's Challenge, you bastards. Well, it's either that or you get the Google translated version of the Suikoden PSP game that I've always wanted, but this will do, I guess. And that's all I got for today. The world of video game fan translations is so vast that covering every single one of them would be an insane ask, but I hope I've spotlighted a couple games that you might find interesting, or, you know, some new stuff that's pretty cool. Definitely go check out some of the newer stuff you can play on PSP and Wii. It's amazing what a bunch of these companies passed up on back in the day. It's also like fun video games. Anyways, catch me next time when I talk about that thing I said I was gonna do last time, but I messed up because my schedule got a little gabagoo. Thanks for watching. Make sure to click the link down in the description to get your free trial for Skillshare today. Thank you so much for watching. Special Patreon shout out to Blackfoot Ferret, Brendan Howell, Chris Shelton, Christopher Olivia, D.A. Stevens, DJ Ellis, Darren Newton, Donnan, DX Buster, David Molnar, Eli Shane Staufenecker, GM Pinks, Jay Roos, Jacoby Fitzpatrick, Jordy McCaffrey, Kevin Zanowski, Kieran Arter, Legend Gary, Nick Irving, P-Funk, Ryan Talbert, and Zach Porter. Thank you guys so much for the generous support. This video took a lot of research, but we did it. And also, holy crap on the response to the Balan Wonderworld video. You guys are insane. Thank you so much. I have a lot of work to do. You'll see it very soon. It's Wednesday, I think. I'm gonna go sleep.